Thanks, Sue. I'm just going to speak fairly briefly just to give some background about the seroconversion study. And particularly I want to do this because this is one of the points in the history of the seroconversion study where we do need to sort of take time and reflect. And I say that because this current version of the seroconversion study that you're going to hear the report on today has come to an end. It's, the data collection period ended in the middle of last year, and we're doing the final reporting. And hopefully there will be a future, but we'll come to that. And we've had these moments at several times in the past because, as Sue alluded to, there's been a version of the seroconversion study for about 25 years in Australia, which is pretty amazing. They've been slightly different over time, particularly in terms of the methodology, how people have been recruited into the study. But the guts of it, what the study has been about, has largely remained the same over time. So we have 25 years of a study of people who have been recently diagnosed with HIV. And if you think about that history, and it's been continuous but for breaks of about 2 years in one spot and 2 years in another spot. But if you think about that history, that 25 years, we've gone from a situation where in the early 1990s where deaths were at their highest and HIV was truly a death sentence, and it was crisis mode. And then in the late 90s, the arrival of effective treatments changed that enormously, and HIV, to some extent, started to retreat from how people think about things. And then, more recently, what we've come to is a completely different scenario where biomedical prevention has changed the nature of the way that we think about HIV pretty much fundamentally. And yet, we have the voices of people who have been recently diagnosed from every single part of that journey. That's pretty amazing. That doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Now, what's so valuable about that, I think, is not necessarily the figures, the percentages that we will see from the study here now. They're obviously important. But what the study has actually been able to do throughout that entire history has been that it's sat there in the background throughout the epidemic, so that every now and then, fairly consistently, people have been able to hear these voices of people who have been recently diagnosed. Not just the facts and figures, but their voices. And that's really important. That's an amazing resource that we've always been able to rely on. We've always been able to hear those voices and think about what does that mean in terms of the work we do, the way we respond. That's a remarkable thing. I think we need to take the time to think about that, reflect on that. We have, because of that, also this enormous database of information that exists nowhere else in the world. Hopefully, at some point, sometime soon in the future, we'll be in a position to be able to think about what that means and bring that together in some way that will be able to allow us to reflect historically as well as just thinking about what this means in terms of our work. So from that perspective, I think it's really important for us to take that time when we're looking at these data to be thinking about where it's come from and what it means now. That's a really important thing to do. What Ian's going to take over from me in a couple of moments, and what he'll be doing is working through the data from the most recent version of the seroconversion study. And that recent version began at the end of 2007, and as I said, data collection ceased in the middle of last year. There were some changes that took place, and the major change being that because we took the study online, we effectively took it out of the clinics and allowed it to be much more inclusive in terms of the way that people could come to participate in the study. That actually then allowed us to take it national, whereas previously it had been confined to Sydney mostly and with a little bit of Melbourne. And that's, I think, that's made the study even more valuable than it was before. So I think that's all that I want to say to you at the outset. I'll turn over to Ian now to run you through the main findings from this latest iteration of the study. Thanks.
Thanks, Garrett, and thank you, Sue, for the introduction. So I'm going to run through some of the key findings from the study. Garrett and I have been here a few times during the course of the study to provide some feedback of the results as we're still collecting them. So some of you may have heard some of these data, but with a smaller sample before, whereas some of you may not have heard from the seroconversion study data. So I do encourage, as Sue said, if you could just jump in and ask any questions at any time, because we've done a couple of these feedback sessions elsewhere, and we find that they tend to be more interesting when people sort of chip in and ask questions about what the implications might be in your work or in this particular context in WA. So just move forward. No, it's not working.
It's really not working. Okay, there we go.
All right, so as Garrett mentioned, the data that I'll present this morning were collected between December 2007 and August 2015. During that time, we had 707 men who attributed their infection to sex with another man who completed the online survey. And I'll just mention that for a period of time, the survey was open also to all people who were recently diagnosed. But this morning's presentation, I'll just be speaking about those men who attributed their infection to another man, sex with another man. Of those 707 men, 113 were interviewed in depth. So at the end of the online survey questionnaire, all participants were invited to provide contact details should they be volunteer for an interview. So about a quarter of people did provide their contact details to be contacted for an interview. And overall, the study aims were to understand the circumstances in which these people acquired their infection, and also identify any changes that may have occurred since receiving their diagnosis. For the most part, referrals into the study, because it was an online survey, for the most part, referrals came from online sources. So banner ads on AIDS Council websites or PLHIV organisation websites, or even people looking for themselves. So if people, when the study was actively recruiting, if you went to Google and entered HIV diagnosis, actually the seroconversion study was sort of the second result. So a lot of people just found it, after receiving the diagnosis and going home and trying to find information on the internet, they would come across the survey that way. But also sexual health services and other clinicians provided referrals. For the most part, people participated in the study quite recently following receiving their diagnosis. The eligibility criteria, for the most part, were having received their HIV diagnosis within the previous 2 years. However, because, as Garrett said, previous seroconversion studies in Australia had been restricted to mostly Sydney, with a few in Melbourne. So we wanted to allow people in other jurisdictions that opportunity to do a bit of catch-up. So the requirement that the infection or the diagnosis was made within the last 2 years was somewhat relaxed. But still, we find that about half of the participants did in fact complete the survey within the 6 months of having received the diagnosis, and some people did it on the day or the day after receiving the diagnosis. And there were comments. There was a comment box at the end of the survey where we asked people if they had anything else they would like to say. And we found that a lot of people were thanking us for the opportunity to provide their story. So, even among those who were very recently diagnosed, participating in the survey actually gave them something. They felt like they were doing something good. So over the course of the study, given that the eligibility criteria haven't been diagnosed in the last 2 years, we looked at the number of men who were diagnosed, who attributed their infection to sex with another man. That's in the surveillance data column. So for each year, you see the number of, so the population that we were trying to recruit from, that is the population. And we see the year that the men who participated in the study were diagnosed. And you can see the proportions. It was over 10%. It reached, in 2010, it was almost 15% of the whole population that we were looking to recruit were able to recruit. So we were very pleased that, with this result, because it's a sort of general rule of thumb that if you conduct research on a population, if you can achieve 10% of that population, then you can quite reasonably argue that it's sort of representative of that population. So yeah, we're pretty pleased with being able to recruit nationally, and we thank our partners for that, the clinics and the community organisations who helped us with that, and the health department. I know this did a lot of work helping to recruit, so thank you. So looking at the whole sample, there's 707 men, and where they were diagnosed, in which state or territory that they were diagnosed. And then looking at the surveillance data, so where the diagnosis occurred over the same period of time, you can see that we managed to recruit men from a geographical distribution that was very similar to the distribution of where infections were actually diagnosed. So you can see that almost 40% of infections are diagnosed among gay men in New South Wales, but we got about 30%. So, and here, during the period of the study, there were 383 men in WA who were diagnosed having attributed their infection to sex with another man. We recruited 40, so again, just over 10% there. So we're pleased with that. Okay, so I'll just go on and describe the characteristics of our sample. So the men in our sample had a mean age of just under 35, whereas the men in the surveillance data, so of all men who were diagnosed during that time, they had a mean age of 37. So our sample are slightly younger, and that could be because this is an online survey, so perhaps that itself meant that younger people were more likely to self-select to participate in an online survey. In terms of the country of birth, about 70% of our sample were born in Australia, which is sort of similar to the surveillance data, and in fact the proportion who were born elsewhere is the same as what we see in the surveillance data. So yeah, we're pretty confident that we can argue that the sample is representative of the population that we're looking at. In terms of gay identity, a very large proportion identified as gay, with just 6% identifying as bisexual. It's perhaps worth noting that there were a couple of men in the sample who did identify as heterosexual. However, nonetheless, they did report sex with another man at the time they acquired their infection. Is there anything else you want to say about gay identity? In the periodic surveys, for example. Yes?
Just in terms of the self-identification, was there like an option for other?
Yes. Yeah. So that's where, because there are a few. As I say, there were about 2 guys who were heterosexual, and then the remaining were other. Yeah. And just on that, I guess, because what is in the periodic surveys, the gay identity?
It's about 6%, about the same as that.
Oh, okay, for bisexuality. So the sample, highly educated, more than half had a university education, 1 in 5 had postgraduate qualifications. So I guess on this is just worth saying that again, similar to gay community attached men, similar demographically and not so much behaviourally, but similar to the men in the periodic surveys, gay community attached men. However, we do see that about 1 in 7 reported ever having been paid for sex, and of those, but just over a quarter had been paid for sex within the 12 months prior to the diagnosis, which is sort of higher than we might see in periodic surveys or other similar samples of gay men. Yes?
So was it paid other transactions, or was it simply around cash?
We just asked, have you ever been paid for cash?
So whatever that means for the person.
Yep. And so we asked about whether or not the participant had a primary regular partner at the time of the high-risk event, and we word that as someone you would call your boyfriend, partner, husband. And about 42% reported being in a relationship with a primary regular partner, which is somewhat lower than what we would see in the periodic survey, for example, in which about 2/3 of guys would report being in a regular relationship. 70% is there. Of the men in the seroconversion study who were in a regular relationship, 15% were in a serodiscordant relationship, so that is that the participant was the negative partner at the time and they had a positive partner. Almost 90% reported sex with casual partners in the 6 months prior to the diagnosis. 40% reported having more than 10 casual partners during that period, and I think that's about a quarter in the periodic surveys. It's about a quarter of men report having more than 10. So they appear to be highly sexually active or have a large number, a high number of sex partners. More than half reported having engaged in group sex, and so this is in 6 months prior to diagnosis, and that engaged in group sex in the previous 6 months in the periodic surveys would be 40?
It's higher again.
Yep. So we asked about men's preferred role in anal sex, and men in this sample were most likely to report that they preferred to be the receptive partner, but with a similar proportion reporting that they like both positions equally, but just a smaller proportion reported a preference to be the insertive partner. And the reason I put that information there is because it's it's in contrast to what we saw from the Health in Men study, which was a study of HIV negative, it was a longitudinal cohort study conducted in Sydney between 2001 and 2007 with 1,400 HIV negative men at baseline who had 6 monthly interviews. And in that sample, over 30% of participants reported a preference for the insertive role. However, when talking about preference, it's worth saying that only 10% of participants were 100% exclusive in their practice of insertive anal intercourse. But nonetheless, I do think it's interesting that what we understand about the way in which HIV is transmitted, we know that the receptive partner is more vulnerable to HIV infection, and among those HIV negative men, their preference was for insertive, but among these men who seroconverted, their preference was for receptive.
Ian, can I just go back to I just want to make the point that it's not just the health and men data that are different. Pretty much every survey where these kinds of questions are asked, it's usually about 60%, 50 to 60% of men say that they're versatile, preferring a couple one, and equally about 20% who prefer the receptive role or prefer the insertive role. So this is very different, and of course that makes sense given the ones who've been infected. But it is really interesting to note just how different that is.
Okay, we asked men where they would meet, and this is in the 6 months prior to diagnosis. We asked where they would meet other men for sex. And when we started in 2007, when we first designed the questionnaire, mobile apps hadn't really taken off, I suppose. So over the course of the study, we had to adapt to, lots of changes that occurred, since 2007. So one of those things was we added mobile apps. So men meet online primarily, and using their mobile apps. And I think that this is pretty similar to what we see in the periodic survey around how men meet other men. Okay, now these are the this again. So this is in the 6 months prior to the diagnosis. We ask about the sexual practices during that period, and so we see. I think that the most important thing to sort of highlight here is this figure here. So almost 2/3 of men reported having some receptive condomless anal intercourse with casual partners whose HIV status they did not know. Okay, I'm going to move on now to HIV testing. Is there any other? Would anyone have any questions about anything that I didn't cover there? Because there's so much in the study, I had to sort of fly through everything. But I mean, I'm willing to expand on anything. Okay. So we asked men, had they previously tested for HIV prior to the test at which they were diagnosed with HIV, and almost 80% report having previously tested. Now, in the periodic surveys, I mean, there's some variation across jurisdictions, but it's about 90% of men in the periodic surveys who would say that they have had an HIV test. So it appears somewhat lower. However, when we look at when the last test prior to diagnosis was, about 70% of the guys in the Seroconversion study said that their previous tests had been within 1 year of the diagnosis. In a periodic survey, that's about 60% who report having had a test in the previous year. So yeah, lower rates of ever testing, but they appear to be more regular testing. We asked men if they delayed testing prior to the test that returned a positive result, and of those men who delayed testing, they said that they delayed testing because they didn't believe they had done anything risky, and also the thing that scored the same proportion actually was a fear of being told that they were HIV positive. So when we did some analysis to look at those men who were tested in the 12 months prior to the diagnosis, and those men who were not tested in the 12 months prior to the diagnosis, and the only thing that was associated with having been recently tested was being more socially engaged with other gay men. So we used 2 questions to determine this, and that's how much of your free time do you spend with other gay men, and how many of your friends are gay men. So those who reported more time and more gay friends were more likely to have been recently tested. So we think this is a good sign that services like M-Clinic, which are situated within the gay community, would help encourage men within that community to test.
Okay, so the point I want to make is just remember that thing there, that one of the main reasons why they delayed testing is the belief that they have not done anything risky. Now, of course, we know that must be because they've seroconverted it, but just remember that when you move on later on to looking at what they actually did sexually, because the contrast is stark.
Yeah, it keeps coming up in various different bits, doesn't it? The not doing anything risky. But okay, so there were, as I say, 113 interviews that were conducted. So just included some qualitative material just to to illustrate some of the points from the quantitative data. So so the interviewer asks, was HIV something that you wanted to avoid? And the response is, something that I wanted to avoid, but it's not something that I necessarily proactively avoided, if that makes sense. Basically, having condomless sex, I knew the risk that I was undertaking and what it could mean for me, probably not in its entirety, but I guess that's one of the reasons why I was getting tested so frequently, because I knew it was a very real possibility of contracting. But I wanted to make sure that if it happened, I was at least on top of it straight away. So I think that's encouraging. I mean, the guy understood what the implications might be of his behaviour, but as he says, not entirely understood them. But nonetheless, it was important that he tested, so that on top of it straight away, both in terms of being treated for it, for his own health outcomes, and also for protecting his partners. Okay, so I'll now go on and describe the high-risk events that these men believe led to their HIV infection. So 83% of men could identify and describe an event that they believe led to their infection. I think it's worth noting that almost 1 in 5 of these men reported the high-risk event as occurring overseas. More than half of the high-risk events occurred in a home, and it was most likely to be the home of the participant's partner. And 1 in 5 occurred in a sex on premises venue. So, I mean, I think it's worth noting there that so the majority would occur in a home. So oftentimes there can be a perception that sex on premises venues are the high risk location, and sure for a proportion, but the home is actually where transmissions are most likely to occur.
So, sorry, just quickly, are these mutually exclusive, or?
Yeah, because
so
this is
24.6 group sex. Wouldn't have been group sex in a home. That 51.
No, the group sex is separate.
Yeah, so that's separate. Yeah, so the group sex actually, I haven't looked at that to see where the group sex occurred, but yeah, but where it happened is mutually exclusive because they describe one event. Yeah. But yeah, so a quarter of men described a high-risk event that occurred in the context of group sex, which is pretty high. Do you want to talk about that, Gary?
Well, given that, for example, in the periodic survey, only about a third of men report group sex in a 6-month period, and we're talking about a single event where a quarter of them are reporting group sex. So clearly, these men are highly sexually active, but also more importantly is just that group sex is definitely one of the characteristics that we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about risky contexts.
I mean, sorry, just to add to that as well, interestingly, empirical data shows a much higher engagement in group sex that is not particularly correlated across age ranges. So we're finding that the group sex may well, in fact, be much more in terms of like normal sexual practice as opposed to esoteric as it might have previously been considered.
Yeah. And can I just mention for those remotely, if you want me to repeat any of the questions or any of the comments, just let me know. Okay, looking at the actual the anal sex practices that occurred at the high risk event, I'll just let you read them rather than me read them out. But I thought I'd highlighted one. But so just over 70% reported resective condomless anal intercourse, and about 44% reported receptive condomless anal intercourse with ejaculation. So, like as Garrett mentioned earlier, these men, when asked why, if they hadn't tested in the previous 12 months, why they hadn't, they were most likely to say because they hadn't done anything risky. But I think this is the point that Garrett was pointing out, that they clearly engaged in quite risky behaviour. I mean, more than 80% report any condomless anal intercourse.
Can I just point out that obviously the highest risk practice, the receptive condomless anal intercourse with ejaculation, 44%, that proportion is like minuscule in most samples that go in. So it's like extraordinarily different.
Okay, looking at whether there was any drug use at the time of the high-risk event, and in half of the cases there was some drug use. That was most likely to be ammo, with a third of guys reporting that they used ammo at the high-risk event. 1 in 7 reported using crystal at the high-risk event, 10% Viagra, 10% marijuana, and GHB less than 7%. So I showed you the...
it is interesting to note that those three drugs, the most common ones, Anil, Crystal and Viagra, are also the ones that have been identified as the strongest predictors in terms of drug use, the strongest predictors of HIV infection in other cohort studies. So it is interesting to note that they are the three most common.
Do you guys ask about alcohol usage?
Oh, yes, we do.
Is that a different section? Or?
I haven't put that onto these slides. And
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
Yep.
I just note part of the reason why we don't focus on it is because it's never actually been identified as a risk factor.
Sure.
It's never been in terms of Australian data. It's just, in fact, the only time, interestingly, the only time that it ever came out as being a possible predictor was actually in reverse. Men who were less likely to improve were more likely to seroconvert, which of course makes no sense. But we finally realised that the reason that was the case was because those who used those drugs were less likely to be drinking.
So yeah, there appears to be little evidence that the men in the seroconversion study were applying any risk reduction strategies at the time when they acquired their infection. So we wanted to have a bit of a closer look to understand, to explore whether or not that was in fact the case. So what we did, some of you may be familiar with the Pleasure and Sexual Health Study, which was a study that was run by Garrett that began recruiting in 2009. It was had very similar recruitment methods, had very similar questions. I mean, it was a study for all gay men, not so positive or negative. And that study asked men to describe their most recent occasion of condomless anal intercourse and their most recent occasion of anal intercourse with a condom to try and understand what were the differences there. So because we had that data set that was collected in a very similar manner, using very similar questions, we compared the men in the seroconversion study who reported their high-risk event as being an occasion of condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner with the men in PASH who were HIV negative and described a recent occasion of condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner. Now we looked at that sample of PASH men to see how many had been subsequently tested following that occasion of condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner, and a third had tested and had tested negative, and we compared those men who had tested and hadn't tested and found that there was very little differences between them. So we're working on an assumption that the condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner described by the men in PASH was an occasion of condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner that did not result in an HIV transmission. We're comparing that with the seroconversion study where these are men who do believe that their occasion of condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner did result in an HIV transmission. So it's not perfect comparison, but when we do the comparison, we do see some quite stark differences. So I think that they're worthy of mentioning. The men in PASH were much more. So remember, these are HIV negative men were much more likely to have condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner who they had sex with previously, and so obviously had met previously. Whereas the men in seroconversion study, they were much more likely to have sex, condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner who they had just met for that first time, and so less likely to have had sex previously. Also, the men in PASH were more likely to have condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner who they believed to be HIV negative, whereas this was less so for the men in the seroconversion study. So here, familiarity and serosorting appear to be occurring in those HIV negative men in PASH, whereas less so. There's much less evidence of that in the men in the seroconversion study. The men in PASH were much less likely to report that their condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner occurred in the context of group sex, just 1 in 10. Whereas, so remember, this is restricted now to those men in the seroconversion study who report that they acquired their infection through sex with a casual partner, because it's condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner. It was, so more than a third of those say that that wasn't in the context of group sex. The men in the seroconversion study were much more likely to be the receptive partner in this occasion of condomless anal intercourse with a casual partner, and much more likely to have their partner ejaculate inside them. So we see here that it would appear as if perhaps the men in PASH are employing strategic positioning and withdrawal, whereas there's less evidence of that in the men in the seroconversion study. So, yeah, there's little evidence of risk reduction among the men in the seroconversion study.
Can I just ask you to go back though to the previous slide? Because I think it's really important for us to think about this. I think that there's some important implications. Because this is that overwhelmingly we're talking about men identifying that the occasion of their infection was an occasion when they had sex with someone they had just met on that occasion. That's a really important piece of information that needs to be considered, I think.
And that comes up again. Okay, so just another quote here. It's on risk behaviour. A large portion of sexual activity that I was engaging in was condomless sex. There was only a handful of times where a condom was used. I'm a bottom, so I'm always the receiver. I'm never the giver. I just never enjoyed the feeling of sex with a condom on. I always felt like there was some kind of barrier. I guess there is. But yeah, the connection wasn't really there if there was a condom being used. But it was also in relation to the end result of the climax, the ejaculation. I didn't appreciate that being inside a condom. I preferred that to be either inside me or on me. And I think that, it's all very well to talk about, encouraging men or educating men around risk reduction strategies, but it's also important to consider that there are some men for whom, the sexual pleasure relies on particular acts that are in fact the highest risk of acts. So, it's all very well to suggest to this guy that, condoms or strategic positioning or withdrawal would help him avoid, his infection. But if that's what he enjoys the most, then he needs something else. And I mean, it's great now because, PrEP would have been, the ideal intervention for this guy had it been available at that time. Or yes.
Just on this as well, I think this reminds me, this slide, one, that people sexualise different aspects of sexual experiences, and two, for me, this kind of calls out to the idea that even in what some people might view as superficially an unintimate experience, people are creating a sense of intimacy, and condoms, unfortunately, have been associated with a lesser intimacy or lesser trust or lesser connection.
Yes.
And so that's a big thing for
some men.
For some men, yes, not for everyone, but for some people that is the case, and I've heard that before as well. So I think it's an interesting, it's a complex, isn't it, that these people are having potentially a one-off experience with someone that just met, but they are seeking some kind of intimacy. It's not just a physiological, unintimate, 100% unintimate experience.
Yep, that's right. Okay, so we did ask men about post-exposure prophylaxis, and we found that over half had heard of PEP, just under 60% had heard of PEP at the time of the high-risk event. Of those who had heard of PEP, almost a third, or just over a quarter, had accessed it previously. When we asked why, obviously we could only ask those who knew about PEP or had heard about PEP at the time of the high-risk event why they didn't access PEP following the risk event. Again, we see that not believing that the risk was sufficient was the primary response there. However, there were some stories about people's prior experiences of accessing PEP that put them off. So, for example, this guy said, and this was just on a free text box on the survey. He said, "Obtaining PEP was horrendous and one of the worst experiences of my life. It's easier just to accept getting HIV, hence my decision not to go a third time." And I think it's important to mention that because these were responses to online survey, we couldn't interrogate these responses. But my understanding is that, I don't know if we can say from this one, but I think from the next one, it would appear to be that the experience of going to an emergency department is not the ideal place to go for PEP, which is difficult because, if the exposure occurs on a Friday night or a Saturday night, you want people to access PEP as soon as they can, and in most cases, the emergency department is the better option there. But it would appear it's not. That there's some room for improvement around dispensing PEP, because I think there's another quote. The last time I asked about taking PEP at the local hospital, I was met with attitude and condescension. This made me feel like asking for PEP was a crime and that I was taking up valuable resources by asking. So, and I do believe that FAO are actually working on updating the PEP, trying to get the PEP guidelines updated and do some more work with particularly emergency department staff. So, but later on, in 2010 we asked questions about PrEP, but it was sort of poorly understood. Like, some people said that they took PrEP, but then we asked, the next question was, did you take it before or after? And they said they took it after. So, we don't have any data on PrEP, but...
presumably we wouldn't, of course.
Well, yes.
But can you go back to that? Because there are a couple of things I want to point out about this. First off, that it's less than 60% that had heard of PEP. Now, that's, to me, pretty dreadful. And that's actually lower than the proportion during the survey who were aware of PEP. So these are the men who seroconverted who didn't know about PEP. That's truly problematic. Then the second thing I want to point out again is this thing about not believing that they were actually engaging in risky behaviour. We know what they were doing. And they clearly were. But they actually made this decision in their head. Now, why would they do that? And I think it's got partly to do with this, the qualitative material, which shows how not very easy that process is. But the other thing I want to point out about this is that, of course, this is from the perspective of the men themselves, not the perspective of the health workers. And I'm not doubting what they're saying at all. I think that's absolutely probably correct. But I think also probably a lot of the time the health workers think that they're doing right. But nonetheless, there's this sense of being judged that's taking place. So it probably means that there has to be a whole lot more understanding of the sensitivity of the situation. Because I really don't think that most health workers, I know there are exceptions who truly are abysmal, but most health workers would not be doing that consciously.
I think also in terms of not believing the risk being sufficient, I mean, if you take a sexual history with a client and they have, say, 3 incidences of receptive condomless anal in the last 3 months or something, the given reasons why someone will think it was risky with one person and not with another and not with the other really vary depending on the person's relationship with that person, or if they did feel that it was more intimate and therefore more personal, more trusting and more caring in that sense, and that will impact on their belief that they should access PEP afterwards because they either think it's risky or they don't. Because if it was drunk or something or under the influence of other substances and they didn't know the person so well, then they will believe it's a risk, and if it's someone they trusted, whatever that means for them, then they're not going to think of it as risky, and PEP's not even going to be on the horizon.
I think that's true, but remember that overwhelmingly these men had not known the person on the occasion, they didn't know the age.
But they still believed it was trusting and caring.
Yeah, I'm not doubting.
Yeah.
So that 57.8%, is that across the whole data set?
Yep.
So has that changed? I mean, have we seen that number go up? I just can't remember what it was in the last.
Yeah, it hasn't changed.
So despite all the money we spend around the country promoting PEP, we haven't budged the awareness level amongst us.
Yeah. I don't know. We haven't looked specifically year by year.
No,
but that figure hasn't changed over time.
No, I didn't look different. I just that's what I thought it was.
Maybe.
Periodic survey, that just hasn't changed that much.
That's true. The periodic survey is higher.
Not much,
You're right.
not much.
It's not a lot, but there's a little bit back.
Yeah.
60 to 65%.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's plateaued at that level over time. But at least the men should.
Yes. But we sort of, it heads against the wall thing, how can we get the message out there? It's not just in WA, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
That's right.
So,
But Garrett, you're obviously very successful in recruiting the men into this study, the high-risk men. So are those similar channels being used to promote PEP? Do you know?
That's an interesting point.
Obviously saw the surveys, they might see.
But then they were looking after the diagnosis.
That's true.
Look, one thing I'd say is that probably what we've discovered in the past year with all the PrEP trials is it seems the most effective way of attracting very highest risk men is to give them a PrEP pill. We've got
So you might be able to jump on the back of that as well to raise awareness of PEP.
I wonder if PEP is being discussed at high schools and universities for people who are newly coming out and who are newly engaging in same-sex interactions. They are going to be the most vulnerable, aren't they, that they might not know. And a lot of those people get their education from their peers when the school system has failed them, and if their peers aren't telling them. But we have a captive audience when they're at high school or at university.
Yep. Yeah, it's probably worth looking at.
Well, in the context of HIV exposure as well, it doesn't have to be just men or women. HIV positive people, heterosexual people can do PEP.
Yeah, of course.
Look, obviously that's good. But remember again who these men are. Their average age is 35.
Yeah.
Being in the gay community for a while. They're obviously individuals who are younger, and it would be enormously better if everybody was told about it in schools, etc. Yes, but nonetheless, it doesn't take away from the fact that there's a problem in communicating to very high-risk men. But I think we would all assume there's not really less than it seems to be.
I guess the good thing about the second PEP guidelines that are being produced by Ashton is that they recommend clinicians to talk to the person about progressing from PEP to PrEP, and as with that previous little quote from the person, it's obviously the third time they'd accessed it, so hopefully in the future, after the first or second time, they will then be streamlined onto PrEP, possibly.
Yep.
I guess the slide is telling us that these people are not imagining that they're engaging in risky behaviour. So just for those people that are, there's a bit of othering going on, and I hate to think what the participants in the sample consider the high-risk people should be doing. But it's obviously not on their radar. It's like selling a car to someone that doesn't drive, right? It's a product that's not built for them.
Yep.
And so why would they have any interest in selling any sort of marketing to them?
Yeah, that's right.
Kind of maybe waste.
Especially because it's an annoying process. You have to ED and then sit there for ages, or you could be at home in bed, basking in the glory of the great sex you just
That is exactly the point, I think. Yeah. And that's why it's a cost-benefit analysis that's going to be done. Okay, I've done something that's risky, but how risky is it? Is it worth it to go through this? That's what they're judging me.
Well, that's the key to the word believing, isn't it? If the alternative in believing it was sufficient is to change the belief and avoid the horrendous experience, but of course the same it wasn't sufficient.
Exactly.
Okay, so now I'll just talk a little bit about the participant's relationship to the person who they believe to be the source of their infection. And just to look over the course of of our seroconversion study, we've seen that so Sukipax in 2003 did some analysis on the earlier data and found that about 40%, so 2 in 5 of participants believed that the source of their infection was their regular partner. Jonathan Volk in 2006 did some analysis on the next set of data, and again about 40% of participants described their relationship to a regular partner. And Jeff Jin in 2007 wrote a paper in which a third of participants described their infection to a regular partner. So it appears as if there's a trend there that a proportion of infections are ascribed to a regular partner. When Garrett designed our seroconversion study survey for online, he introduced a third category of partner, that of fuck buddy, which sort of breaks down, this regular partner to have a closer look to see what what truly is a relationship to the person considered the source of the infection. So we see that consistently across time, about between 60 to 68% of infections have been attributed to sex with a casual partner. And previously, we were sort of assuming that the remaining third to 40% were between boyfriends. Between regular partners, but we didn't know what that meant. But with the data that we've collected in this study, we see that only 11% of infections are in fact attributed to a boyfriend, with almost a quarter attributed to a fuck buddy. Garrett, would you like to speak some more to that? Because Garrett's very excited about this finding.
Because it's very, very important. Internationally, we see data that looks very different to the Australian context. Because the international data seems to say a majority of infections among gay men are within a relationship. And we, for years, made these assumptions about this proportion that we thought were boyfriends. And yet clearly that's not the case. And why is there this trend over time that looks like it's maybe some decline in regular partner? Well, let's bear in mind that Australia is the only place in the world that has actively embraced, officially, negotiated safety, and the only place in the world that has proactively promoted negotiated safety. Does that mean that our data look different to the rest of the world, particularly North America, because of that fact? I can only assume that that's the case. It has to play some role in that. And if what we're seeing then is that realistically only 10%, 11% of infections are due to sex with a boyfriend, surely that is good evidence that negotiated safety is doing a damn good job in Australia. Which is, in the past we've had the cohort data from the Healthy Men study that has shown no increased infection from that. But this is very strong evidence of negotiated safety being a really important thing. I think that this is not the first time that we've said this, because these data started to emerge early on in the study, so we've reported this before. I think for me, one of the concerns that I have about it is we've been saying this now for a number of years, that proportion that are presumed to be within a relationship is not actually what it appears to be, and there's a very large group in there of fuck buddies. My worry is that there hasn't actually been any response to that fact. That it's sat there as a piece of information, but what do we do with it? We need to react to that in some way.
So we'll just looking a bit in more detail about the characteristics of participants' relationship to the person considered the source person. So when we ask about familiarity, so whether they had met them for the first time at a high-risk event or whether there was some prior knowledge, we see that, I think, so even among those men who report that the source person was their boyfriend, we see that 20% had met them recently, and in the fuck buddy category, even though there was prior sexual contact, or they were considered a fuck buddy rather than a casual partner, we see that for about 2/3 that it was somebody who they had met recently, or for the first time at the high-risk event. I mean, even the boyfriend category, it was someone they had met for the first time at that high-risk event, but so they had subsequently become boyfriends. I mean, we did ask at the time of a high-risk event, how would you describe the relationship to that person? So, but they were boyfriends already by that time, even though they just met. And also looking at previous sex, so we asked, had you had sex with this partner on a previous occasion? And even those, so for the boyfriend, we have 6 who say that was the first time they actually had sex. So I guess, these are from these men who they'd met recently, so they were just forming a relationship. And in fact, at the time when they acquired their infection, it was the first time. So that's, and if we add that up at the end, I mean, that's 50% who ascribed their infection to their boyfriend. It's a boyfriend who they'd certainly first had sex with in the 3 months prior to their to the high risk event, and similarly, I mean, I think it's 20, so it's more than 50% of fuck buddies were in a similar situation, and the majority of casual partners. So, I mean, essentially here what we see is people are much more likely to acquire HIV from someone they've met recently. Or just met.
And the other point about it is that remember that it was only 11% that identified their boyfriend as being a partner. That when we take into account these data, it's actually a really tiny proportion that negotiated safety actually applies to. On one hand, I think negotiated safety has done a remarkably good job in Australia. But now we need to start thinking about what does that mean on the other side of the ledger.
Is there any rationale given for that from the participants? Any qualitative data on that? Asking why they had a high chance of having high-risk events with someone they just recently had sex with for the first time?
We haven't really looked at that within the qualitative data. Nothing, I can't think of anything that springs to mind.
I'm not sure.
I mean, I do remember going through some interviews where guys would talk about, they would meet somebody, they would have sex with a condom, and then, even, stay the night, and then in the morning they would have sex without a condom because, already just, through that process of, they'd already had sex, they'd spent the night together, and then, so already, I mean, I think it goes to what you were speaking about earlier about trust and how, easily that can be felt to have been established. So,
I think also in a lot of the interviews, there's that notion of a very intense encounter, really, where intimacy comes into play very much, but also just desire. And I think that can't be discounted. But I think in retrospect, it would have been really useful to ask a question along the lines of what you're saying. The problem is that we weren't anticipating these data. This is what we've identified after all these years of looking at the data and saying, wow, it's actually about really recent partners.
I wonder if there's an element of performance in that when you have sex with a regular partner that you've had sex with for a long period of time, there's less pressure on this performance idea of being a good sexual partner, and the two of you have a routine and have a shared understanding of the kind of pattern of the way that you have sex. Whereas when you're with a brand new partner, it could be that people will have more cognition in their mind, I want to be a good sexual partner, I want to perform well, therefore for some people performing well means taking greater risks than they would usually take. I wonder if it's only speculation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that may play a part in something, but I think that it's actually simpler than that. These are men who are highly sexually active, participating in highly sexually active subcultures, and in that context, they're just more likely to place themselves in those situations where they're at risk. And it just comes down to that.
If you go back to the other data where the drug use, if you include that in, when they had first sex, if there was drugs involved, or where they met them, whether it would be online or at a sauna, where the percentages were higher. So that all takes into account that figure, I suppose.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, there has to be some of that involved, yes. But consistently in the Australian data, we've seen where we've done analyses of the impact of drug use on sexual risk behaviour. And yes, there's a relationship between sexual risk behaviour. Men who are riskier are more likely to use, and particular drugs especially. But when you look at the men who engage in risk behaviour, and you compare the times when they use a condom with the times when they do not use a condom, and yes, they use drugs at high rates, but the drugs don't distinguish between whether or not they use a condom. Now, I absolutely get that, of course, in some cases men get fucked up and they fuck up. But to use the drugs as an explanation for why they may or may not use a condom, I don't think is actually supported by the data. It's really just that men who are more likely to take risks are also more likely to use drugs, because that's the subculture in which they play. They are players, so therefore, that's not to take away from them that there are some people fuck up.
So if we look at the data versus people, the 11% who acquired it from their partner versus the 20, I think it was 23 from a fuck buddy, then is that right to think that negotiated safety is working better within a partnered relationship, but less effective with fuck buddies? So if you take that premise, then I'm thinking one of the reasons maybe why some people have fuck buddies is because they get to be a little bit more adventurous. That's the whole, that's one of the motives for having a fuck buddy is, diversity, variation.
But the thing
and
is
they're taking more risk.
But the thing is that negotiated safety was never intended for fuck buddies or for anything other than established relationships. The basic premises of negotiated safety, for example, were was talk, test, trust. So, and the test was 3 months. So the assumption built into the whole thing is a relationship of at least 3 months length.
But in that context, what's the distinction between a relationship and a fuck buddy?
Well, is there one? I don't know. The problem is that negotiated safety, the way it's been defined, has been specific to an ongoing committed relationship.
Sure.
The fact that what we're seeing is fuck buddy relationships, they don't actually fit into that definition. So, while the advice, some men may have adapted that advice to their fuck buddy circumstance, it's not what it was intended for. And so, realistically, it's that they're in the same situation as in the mid-1990s prior to negotiated safety for relationships, i.e., they're trying to work with something without the tools because the tools haven't been provided. Nobody's actually given them formal information that might help them to adapt that to that style of relationship. That has not been something that's been talked about.
But there are other forms of, your study put it this year or last year, around relationships. So what I thought the level of negotiation within relationships that incorporated external fuck buddies was much higher than I thought we'd seen in the past. So the short test trust is a model that, as you say, was developed in the 90s, very much in Sydney, I guess, originally, by ACON. But it hasn't perhaps adapted and evolved as gay men's relationships have adapted and evolved in a much more open way. So,
Yeah, that's right.
so I think, maybe what you're saying is that actually we need to look at this and think that we need to start to think a different language in terms of how we talk about safety.
That's right.
Yeah.
Without taking away from what we were looking at.
No, absolutely. Because this is just, it's just about keeping up with the community and not catching up.
I guess a strategy that I talk about with my clients is to promote safety and the option of increased communication. So it's a version of negotiated safety is that instead of having a one-off partner every week or every whatever number of days, it's about having a cohort of fuck buddies that you have more of a relationship with, more of a rapport with, and you might have an increased chance of being able to talk about HIV with, then it's going to be too awkward to talk about HIV with a one-off person that you're going to have one experience with. So I'm trying to encourage my clients to look at that as an option of promoting their safety. If they're not going to use condoms or only use them sporadically, then it's safer to do that with people you have some familiarity with, and you might be able to talk about some ideas about HIV. Are you positive? Are you not positive? Are you on antiretrovirals? What's your viral load like? For these people who are interested in going down a more complex path of talking about HIV. And I guess that's a newer version, a more organic version of negotiated safety.
Call it a closed circle, a closed up buddy circle.
All right, we might go on, because do we have to finish at 11:30? Yeah, we have to. So yeah, just talking about diagnosis now. So we asked guys about why they did, what was it that motivated them to test at the time when they did actually test positive. And most commonly guys report that they tested at that time because they had symptoms that made them worry. So they were experiencing seroconversion, symptoms that they thought might be a seroconversion illness. So it's just worth noting here that we asked all guys if they recall any symptoms that may have been a seroconversion illness, and I think it's dead on half say that they did, and half say that they did not recall any symptoms. So I think here there's an opportunity to just remind guys that they may not experience symptoms, so don't rely on those symptoms to prompt to go to a test. So about a quarter of guys tested because it was part of their regular testing pattern. And again, we see this thing come up. It was just under 1 in 5 who report that they got tested because they believed that they did something risky. Here, sorry if you can't read this. So this was expectations at the time of the HIV test, at the time of the diagnosis, and I'll just read. So the top line there says, "I had absolutely no expectation that I would test positive," and 40% of guys very much believed that was the case. They didn't believe that would happen. I'll just move on quickly. So how the HIV test result was received at the time of the diagnosis, and we see 65% went back at a later date to see the nurse. And just a note on the sample size just now. So we changed, obviously, with the changes that occurred in terms of new testing options and treatments, prevention and PrEP and things. We introduced questions throughout the study as these things arose. So that's why the sample size is smaller there. But we do see, so at this time, 12% of guys said that they, it appears as if they tested following a rapid test. We asked guys how they would prefer to receive the HIV test results. So we asked them if they were satisfied with the way they'd received them, and primarily they were. And here we see that actually there is a strong preference to receive the results straight away rather than having to wait for a repeat visit. any questions on diagnosis? It's a bit quick, but we're running out of time. So now I'm just going to talk about after diagnosis. So we looked at changes in sexual behaviour following diagnosis, and we do see that after diagnosis, behaviours do change quite dramatically, and in ways that would likely minimise the possibility of onward transmission. Now, these questions were asked differently over time. From 2007 to 2010, we asked a whole block of questions about the 4 weeks prior to diagnosis, and a whole block of questions again about 4 weeks post-diagnosis. And what we can see is that the proportion of men reporting no casual partners in the 4 weeks after diagnosis increases, and in fact, so the number of casual partners decreases following diagnosis. And also when we look at risky or the potential for onward transmission, we can see the proportion of men who report condomless anal intercourse with partners that they don't know to be HIV positive, that proportion reduces following diagnosis. Now, Garrett ran this analysis, and he tried to tested all the demographic variables and all the characteristic variables to see what were the factors that were associated with this change in behaviour, and he found that the only thing that was associated with reducing number of partners was having sought support from peers, so from other people with HIV. So no other demographic or variable characteristic was associated with having reduced the number of casual partners. And men who had stopped engaging in condomless anal intercourse with non-HIV positive partners following the diagnosis reported greater support from other positive people. The later questionnaire, so we had to make way for other questions, so rather than asking all those questions over those 2 time periods, we simply asked, have there been any changes in your sexual practice since receiving your diagnosis? And if you can't read those, the one at the top reduced the number of partners, 80%, stopped having sex altogether is at 70%, avoid sex with HIV negative men is 61%, tell more people of your status is 56%, and the list goes on. But what we see here is that changes that may or not be intentions to reduce the risk of onward transmission of HIV.
And this might also reflect how long ago they were diagnosed, because initially or whatever, some people might dramatically reduce the number of partners and things that, and employ risk reduction strategies. But then following, when they become more confident, there's less stigma and internalized stigma in that, then it's much more easy and then this can change. Yeah, that's right. We have looked at that over time, particularly with stop having sex altogether, because I was curious to see whether that was something that was sustained. But I did see that even after 1 year, there are still, much lower proportion, but there are still some guys who haven't had sex altogether. But yeah, it does change in terms of time. Yeah.
Can I just clarify the previous slide? Peer support, was that non-professional peers? So that's just
undefined as any kind of support from other positive people.
Yeah, seeking out other positive people. So again, Garrett looked at these changes to see what might predict those changes, and again, access to peer support after diagnosis was the only factor that was associated with reductions in risky sex. While it was also associated with partner reduction, so was depression, which may suggest that partner reduction also reflects the fact that some men don't cope so well and withdraw from sex generally. And there's a reference there to Garrett's paper, which has been published in JADES.
Can I just, before you go on, guys, I think this is a really important set of findings because it provides some very strong evidence to the role of peer support. And the fact that it was exactly the same finding, even though we changed the questions quite dramatically in those 2 time periods, and yet it still came out as the strongest predictor, I think just reinforces that it's a very strong finding. And politically, that's a very useful thing for us to know because it provides very strong evidence for peer support.
And it's sorry.
Did you find out whether treatment and viral load had any impact on behaviour after diagnosis?
Well, we didn't even ask any questions in the survey questionnaire about treatment until 2010, once we understood, once the changes began to occur. And because the majority of men complete the survey within the 6 months prior, just about half of the guys since we've asked the question, about half the guys were on treatment, half were not. I mean, that once we look at if they've been diagnosed for more than 3 months, that goes up to 80%. But in terms of cross-tabbing that with behaviour, we haven't yet looked at that. But I think the numbers would be too small.
It would be pretty difficult to do that, unfortunately, for these particular data.
And actually, so I don't have the data on these slides, but I put together an abstract for ASHM looking at disclosure and likelihood for these men to have disclosed to casual partners, to their friends, and to their family. And in fact, the only thing that was associated with an increased likelihood to disclosed to each of those categories was, again, having support from peers. There were other things that were associated with one or two of the others, such as age. Younger men were more likely to disclose to friends and family. And contact with the epidemic was also associated with one or two, but support from peers was the only one that was associated with being more likely to have it disclosed to all of those relationship category types. So I'll just read through this quote very quickly. So this is about speaking with the participant's doctor rather than and the sort of interaction that occurs there. I get a very clinical response from her rather than emotional or a connecting response from her. So that's why I've reached out to a PLHIV organisation to be able to talk to other people who've been through the experiences that can relate to me. And how has that been? It was actually really good to be able to sit down with a peer worker. I think I'm lucky that peer worker and I have very similar experiences, and we've got very similar personalities. And that's just, like an hour and a half of sitting down and talking to each other. We're like two peas in a pod, basically. I found that really beneficial, but it also really cemented into my head that this doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing in my life. I can use it for good, to have a positive influence in other people's lives as well. And I can do that with organisations like this. So it's not something that I'm looking at doing right away. I'm still not completely me just yet, but yeah, it's shown me more hope than what I had before anyway. So, and another one, I still have, I was saying this to the psychologist, so this is about accessing peer support. This is about going to a peer support workshop. And so I guess just to highlight that, for some there is a little bit of hesitancy, as this guy said. So I still have, as I was saying this to the psychologist today as well, I still have this trepidation of walking into a room full of people whom I don't know, and automatically the first thing they know about me is my HIV status, just because of where I am. I find that really, really hard to comprehend in my head. So, like I said, it seems a little bit silly, but yeah, I'd prefer to walk in and, basically whisper HIV positive, rather than walk into a room and just have automatically everybody knows just because I'm here. Not something I plan on doing, although I've had a couple of people ask me if I'll come with them, and I've not said yes, and I've not said no. Okay, just to race on, I'll talk about decisions around treatment. So as I mentioned, we didn't have it in the survey questionnaire, but it came up a lot in interviews, so I'll just talk, some quotes from more recent interviews, because it definitely changed over time. So this guy says, the idea was trying to start at the start of the year where there mightn't be as much work, because then it's easier to manage side effects as opposed to being very busy, possibly involved in full-time work and then trying to deal with it, which is a little bit harder, I think. I was weighing up in my mind being able to reduce the possibility of damage, So that was occurring to the system from the virus and stuff like that. So I know that in the long term, the medications across the lifespan could obviously cause problems because it's a foreign substance that's going into your body. And with limited amounts of research done, even if it's 5-year clinical trials or however long they do it, it's still, you're taking these drugs for a much longer period of time than what they've researched. But either which way, what do? You don't take the medication, you'll be fine for X amount of years, unless you get an AIDS-defined illness or something like that prior, where you're just stuffed anyway. or you begin medication where you at least feel more confident that you're trying to control something. So as I say, this is from a more recent interview because, people were much more afraid generally previously, whereas, here you can see he's sort of coming around, but he's still not entirely convinced. Now this next quote, this is from somebody who was convinced. He was diagnosed and wanted to go into treatment because he understood the reasons why. But he described the day that he began his treatment, and I think it's sort of interesting to have here. It says, I was away from home. I picked up the medications, I picked up my car, and then I drove to this regional town to work. And I'd planned to start taking them that night. I had a bit of a realization that night, though, because I was away from home. I mean, I lived by myself, but I have a cat at home, so I was by myself in a hotel room, and, I just kind of had this realization that once I take that first pill, that's it. I have to keep taking them every single day for the rest of my life. And I just thought to myself, I'll just give myself one more night of freedom, and I'll do it when I'm back at home in an environment that I'm comfortable in. I gave myself the one more night. I enjoyed my night. I came home and started taking them the next day. So I think, this just goes to show, even for someone who really is behind treatment, he understood the benefits to himself, he understood the benefits that meant that he was less likely to transmit to his partners. But, when it came to the crunch, he just sort of had this, realization that it was a lifelong commitment, and that's a pretty major thing. So, just worth bearing in mind for supporting those people, who are going on, even if they're convinced, it's still a big step.
I guess in terms of the 3 treatment targets, this is where some people are lagging behind, isn't it? In terms of percentages for those who are not accessing treatment. Some are testing quite well, a lot are obtaining undetectable viral loads, but in this category, there's obviously some fear, apprehension about possible side effects, a range of different things, the fact that it's a lifelong commitment. Yeah,
that's right. Yep. And even when they are convinced, it's still, it's a big step.
Very powerful.
Yeah. I want to talk about the differences across jurisdictions because we looked and we found very little. I mean, really it was around access to services, which just sort of reflects the local availability of services in those areas. And similarly, over time, I think the major change that we did see over time was the way men would talk about treatments. And, in the interviews, there certainly appears to have been a change in, intentions to begin early treatment. And I'll skip the summary as well because I do want to mention. Just thank because this is the end of the Seroconversion study. So I'll thank our partners, community partners, and the health department, and all the clinicians and everybody who helped. The report is available online, and it's together with the other reports that we've released during the course of the study.